Somewhere in the western Amazon, buried under 13 million years of sediment, a single bone tells a story that most people would rather not picture. It belongs to a ground sloth, a large, heavy animal, not easy prey by any standard, and across its surface, paleontologists counted 46 individual bite marks. Not from a jaguar, not from an anaconda. From a crocodilian relative so large that the specimen responsible for those marks was probably not even fully grown. Adults of its species reached roughly 12.5 meters, about the length of a city bus, and could generate a bite force estimated at 69,000 newtons. For comparison, a modern saltwater crocodile, the largest living reptile, bites at around 16,000. This thing was in a different category entirely, and it lived in the Amazon, not in some alien landscape, in the river system that still flows through the largest rainforest on Earth. But that prehistoric monster is only one of 7 discoveries connected to the Amazon basin that most people have never heard of, and that collectively demolish the old idea that this was always just an empty green wilderness. Today, we are going to cross thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, from flooded islands at the mouth of the river to hidden cities buried under Bolivian jungle, and what we find at each stop is going to be harder to dismiss than the last. Let us start at the mouth. Marajo Island sits right where the Amazon meets the Atlantic. It is enormous, roughly the size of Switzerland, and for most of the year, large portions of it are underwater. Seasonal floods turn the interior into a vast, shallow lake. It is not the kind of place where you would expect to find the remains of a complex, densely populated society. And yet that is exactly what is there. Scattered across the island are massive elevated platforms called tesos. Some of them cover tens of hectares. They rise above the floodplain like earthen mesa tops, and for decades, archaeologists describe them as entirely artificial. Monumental mounds built by hand, layer upon layer, by a pre-Columbian culture that flourished roughly between AD 400 and 1300. The implication was staggering. If these platforms were fully human-made, then the labor involved would rival some of the most ambitious construction projects in the ancient Americas. But then came the geoarchaeologists, and the story got more complicated. Not simpler, more complicated. Core samples and stratigraphic analysis showed that at least some of the tesos had natural foundations. Parts of these mounds were remnants of older geological formations, ridges and rises that already existed before anyone started building on them. What the people of Marajo did was identify those natural elevations and then radically reshape them. They expanded them laterally. They raised them vertically. They reinforced their edges and built complex settlements on top of them. Over centuries, the tesos became something that was neither purely natural nor purely artificial, but a hybrid, a landscape engineered at its foundations. This matters more than it might sound, because it changes the question. The old question was, how did these people move so much earth? The new question is subtler and, in some ways, more impressive. How did they read this landscape well enough to find the right starting points, and then transform them into permanent habitation platforms in an environment that floods for months every year? Think about what that requires. You need to understand hydrology, where the water rises, how high it gets, how fast it drains. You need to understand soil composition, which earth holds together when saturated, which crumbles. You need to plan not for one season, but for generations. Because these tesos were not temporary camps. People lived on them, buried their dead in them, and produced some of the most elaborate painted ceramics found anywhere in pre-Columbian South America. The Marajoara ceramics alone are worth pausing on. They are distinctive, intricate, and unlike anything produced by neighboring cultures. Anthropomorphic funerary urns, bowls with complex geometric patterns, pieces that suggest a sophisticated symbolic world, and all of it produced on these artificial, natural island platforms in the middle of a seasonal flood zone. What unsettles researchers is not any one piece of the puzzle, it is the whole picture. A society that could reshape a flooded landscape on this scale, sustain itself for nearly 1,000 years, produce distinctive art, and maintain what appears to have been a hierarchical social structure, all in an environment that most modern urban planners would consider uninhabitable without heavy machinery and concrete. And when the Europeans arrived, this culture had already declined. What they found was the aftermath, not the peak. No one is sure why the Marajoara culture faded. Climate shifts, changing flood patterns, internal social pressures, The usual suspects are all on the table, but the tesos remain. You can still walk on them. They are still above the waterline. Now, the Amazon is not typically a place people associate with stone monuments. Wood, earth, water, those are the building materials of the basin. So when something made of stone shows up, and it is big, and it is old, and it is arranged with apparent precision, people pay attention. About 2,400 kilometers northwest of Marajó, in the Brazilian state of Amapá, near a town called Calçoene, there is a site that the media quickly nicknamed the Amazon Stonehenge. The comparison is a bit generous in scale, but the site itself is real and genuinely strange. It is called Rego Grande 1, and it consists of large granite slabs, some of them several meters tall, arranged in a roughly circular formation on a hilltop. The complex is more than 1,000 years old. Burial urns have been found nearby, along with other artifacts suggesting ceremonial activity. This was not a residential site. People came here to do something specific, something that apparently required arranging multi-ton stones in a deliberate pattern on an elevated clearing in the tropics. And here is where it gets interesting. Some researchers have noted that certain stone positions appear to align with the December solstice, the point in the year when the sun reaches its southernmost position. During the solstice, the shadow cast by one particular slab falls in a way that could mark the event. Other alignments may correspond to equinoxes or other seasonal markers. Now, does this prove that Rego Grande was an astronomical observatory? No, it is a hypothesis. A reasonable one, supported by some spatial analysis, but not conclusively proven. The problem with archaeoastronomy is that when you have enough stones in a roughly circular arrangement, some of them will inevitably line up with something in the sky. The question is whether the alignment is intentional or coincidental, and that is very difficult to settle definitively for a culture that left no written records explaining the purpose of the site. What is not debatable is the effort. These are heavy granite blocks. They were quarried, transported, and erected on a hilltop in a tropical region with dense vegetation, high humidity, and seasonal rains. That takes organization. It takes labor. It takes a reason important enough to justify the work. And it takes a society that most history books never mention. The people who built Rego Grande were not part of any civilization that gets a chapter in a standard Western textbook. They lived near the equator in the Amazon estuary region more than 1,000 years ago, and they built a megalithic stone circle. That sentence alone should be enough to make anyone pause and reconsider what they think they know about this part of the world. The site is now partially protected, but decades of neglect, cattle ranching, and limited funding have taken their toll. Several stones have been displaced or damaged. Archaeological work has been intermittent. There is still no comprehensive excavation of the surrounding area, which means that whatever Rego Grande is part of, whatever network of sites or cultural landscape it belongs to, remains largely unmapped. What do you think this site was for? A calendar? A burial ground? A place of gathering for communities spread across the estuary? Or something we do not have a clean category for? Write your answer in the comments, because this is one of those places where the honest answer is still, we are not sure. From a stone circle on a hilltop, we move to something that was hidden, not beneath soil or forest, but beneath the river itself. In October 2023, the Amazon system experienced one of the most severe droughts in recorded history. Water levels on the Rio Negro near Manaus, the largest tributary of the Amazon by volume, dropped to historic lows. Riverbanks that had been submerged for years, sometimes decades, suddenly stood exposed in the open air. And on the rocks at a site called Ponta das Lajes, faces appeared. Not metaphorical faces, literal ones. Carved into the stone by human hands, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, according to estimates by IPHAN, Brazil's National Historic and Artistic Heritage Institute. The petroglyphs include stylized human faces with large eyes and geometric features, along with grooves and polished areas where ancient people apparently sharpened or ground stone tools. The carvings are not small. Some of the faces are clearly visible from a distance, etched deep enough into the rock to survive centuries of submersion and abrasion. Part of the site had been glimpsed before, during a severe drought in 2010. But the 2023 event was worse, and the water dropped lower, exposing a much larger area of carved rock than anyone had previously documented. Archaeologists and heritage officials scrambled to record as much as possible because the window was unpredictable. When the rains returned, the river would rise again, and the carvings would vanish beneath the surface for who knows how long. There is something deeply unsettling about this, not in a supernatural sense, but in a factual one. These carvings exist at a level that is now normally underwater. That means one of two things. Either the people who made them worked in or very near the water, carving at the river's edge during seasonal low points, or the river's baseline level was significantly lower when the carvings were made, and what is now the normal waterline was once dry rock. Either way, the implication is the same. The Amazon system has changed. The relationship between the river and the land is not static. It shifts over centuries, sometimes dramatically, and the evidence of that shift is literally carved in stone by people who lived along these banks long before any Europeans set foot in South America. The 2023 drought did not just expose Ponta das Lajes. Several other archaeological sites along the Amazon and its tributaries were revealed or re-revealed by the falling water. Some had never been formally documented. The drought, as destructive as it was for ecosystems and communities, briefly turned the river into an open-air museum, one that would close again as soon as the rain returned. And that raises a question that no one has fully answered. How many sites like this are still hidden? How much of the human history of the Amazon is sitting right now beneath the waterline, invisible, inaccessible, gradually being eroded by the current? The river is not just concealing the past, it may be slowly destroying it. From faces beneath the water, we go to something that was hiding in plain sight, but on a scale that is almost absurd. In the Llanos de Mojos, a vast savanna wetland region in the Bolivian Amazon, aerial and satellite surveys revealed something that looked, at first, like it could not possibly be real. Across an area of roughly 525 square kilometers, picture a square about 23 kilometers on each side, the landscape was covered in a dense, interlocking network of earthworks. Long, raised embankments, V-shaped barriers, channels, ponds, hundreds and hundreds of individual structures, all connected. This was not a city. It was not a fortress. It was a fish trap. Or, more accurately, it was a fish-catching system, an engineered landscape designed to exploit the annual flood cycle of the Bolivian Amazon. Here is how it worked. During the wet season, the plains flood. Water spreads across the savannas and fish disperse with it, feeding and breeding across a vast, temporary aquatic habitat. When the dry season comes, the water retreats, and in the Bauras region, the retreating water was funneled, by design, into a network of barriers, channels, and terminal ponds. Fish moving with the current were guided by raised earthen walls into increasingly narrow passages, and ultimately into ponds where they could be harvested in enormous quantities. 525 square kilometers. That is not a fishing spot. That is an industrial food production system built entirely out of earth and water, with no metal tools, no machinery, and no draft animals. It covered an area larger than many modern cities. If this is the kind of mystery that pulls you in, the kind where the more you learn, the less the old textbook version of history makes sense, subscribe to the channel, because the Amazon keeps delivering evidence that the people who lived here before European contact were doing things on a scale that most of us were never taught about. The Bauras fish weir system is important for a reason that goes beyond its size. For a long time, a dominant view in Amazonian archaeology held that the rainforest and its associated ecosystems could not support large, dense populations. The soil was too poor. The environment was too harsh. The argument went that only small, semi-nomadic groups could survive here, a few hundred people at most, moving through the forest, leaving little trace. The Bauras system obliterates that argument. You do not build 500 square kilometers of coordinated earthworks for a village of 200 people. This was a landscape designed to feed thousands, possibly tens of thousands. It required planning across generations. It required maintenance. It required social coordination on a scale that implies hierarchy, specialization, and long-term political stability. And yet, by the time Europeans arrived, the system was largely abandoned. The societies that built it had already collapsed or transformed into something unrecognizable. The earthworks remained, slowly eroding, gradually being swallowed by grass and sediment, until someone looked down from above and saw the pattern. Now we go backward in time, way backward, 13 million years backward. The Amazon basin during the Miocene epoch was not the river system we know today. For much of that period, large parts of western Amazonia were covered by a vast wetland system, sometimes described as a mega-wetland or proto-Amazonian lake complex, fed by rivers draining the rising Andes to the west. The climate was warmer. The ecosystem was radically different. And the top predator in that ecosystem was not a cat, not a bird of prey, and not a snake. It was Purosaurus brasiliensis, a giant crocodilian, a relative of modern caimans, but on a scale that makes the comparison almost meaningless. Based on skull fragments and postcranial bones found at multiple sites across the Amazon basin, researchers have estimated that adult Purosaurus reached lengths of approximately 12.5 meters. That is roughly the length of a standard city bus. Weight estimates vary, but most fall above 8 metric tons, heavier than an African elephant. And the bite force, calculated from skull mechanics and muscle attachment sites, has been modeled at around 69,000 newtons. To put that number in perspective, the strongest measured bite of any living animal belongs to the saltwater crocodile, at roughly 16 to 17,000 newtons. Purosaurus had more than 4 times that force. But numbers alone do not convey what this animal was. What makes Purosaurus genuinely haunting is a single fossil find from Peru, published by researchers studying Miocene-era fauna of the Pebas Formation. On a bone belonging to a large ground sloth, itself not a small animal, they identified 46 distinct tooth marks. 46. And based on the spacing and size of the marks, they attributed them not to a full-grown Purosaurus, but to a juvenile or subadult, a young one. Think about what that means. A not yet fully grown Purosaurus attacked and fed on a large ground sloth, and the evidence of that encounter was preserved in the bone for 13 million years. This is not a reconstruction. It is not a guess based on jaw shape or habitat overlap. It is a direct physical record of predation, an exceptionally rare thing in the fossil record. Most of the time, we infer predator-prey relationships from circumstantial evidence. Here, the evidence is literally bitten into the bone. The Miocene Amazon was a world of giants. Purosaurus shared the waterways with enormous catfish, giant turtles, and other large caimans. The ecosystem was structured around a wetland that no longer exists in the same form. The modern Amazon River, as a single eastward draining channel, is a relatively recent development in geological terms. When Purosaurus was alive, the drainage patterns, the water chemistry, and the biological community were all fundamentally different. And here is the part that should stick with you. The Amazon basin today is the most biodiverse place on the planet. It contains more species of fish, birds, insects, and plants than any comparably sized region on Earth. But even this extraordinary richness is a shadow of what once existed. 13 million years ago, the apex predator of this system was a 12-meter armored reptile with the bite force of a hydraulic press. The modern Amazon, for all its wildness, is a tamer place than it used to be. From the deep past to the recent present, and from a single bone to tens of thousands of structures. In July 2026, the journal Nature published a study that quietly redrew the map of pre-Columbian Amazonia. A team of researchers had conducted LiDAR surveys, that is, laser scanning from aircraft, over nearly 4,500 square kilometers of forest in southwestern Amazonia, in the border region of Brazil. The technology works by firing millions of laser pulses through the forest canopy. The pulses bounce off the ground, and the return signal creates a detailed, three-dimensional model of the surface beneath the trees. It is, effectively, a way to see through the jungle. What they found was staggering. Within the surveyed area, the team identified 432 monumental earthworks. Giant geometric shapes, circles, squares, polygons, carved into the ground as deep ditches, some more than 10 meters wide. Many of these structures cover enormous areas. Individual complexes reach nearly 50 hectares. Some are isolated. Others are connected by roads or raised pathways. They are the work of what researchers have called the aquariculture, and their construction began more than 2,500 years ago. Here is the number that made headlines. Of those 432 earthworks found in the surveyed zone, only 36 had been previously known. The rest, nearly 400, were completely new discoveries, hidden beneath unbroken forest canopy, and the surveyed area represented only a fraction of the region where similar structures are expected to exist. Using statistical modeling based on the density of earthworks in the scanned area and the total extent of similar terrain in the region, the researchers estimated that the full number of these structures could be around 23,760. That is not a typo. Nearly 24,000 monumental earthworks, most of them still undetected, buried under the modern forest. Now, a critical caveat. That number is a model-based projection, not a confirmed count. No one has found 24,000 earthworks. The claim is that, based on what we found in the area we scanned, the math suggests that many thousands more are likely out there, waiting. The actual number could be higher. It could be lower. But even if the estimate is off by half, the implication is extraordinary. These are not subtle marks in the soil. These are major construction projects, ditches 10 meters wide, complexes covering dozens of hectares. And they were built by people living in what the rest of the world considered empty wilderness. No draft animals, no metal tools, no wheels. Just human labor, organization, and a vision of landscape transformation that operated on a scale we are only now beginning to measure. The forest grew back over them. Trees filled the ditches, roots broke apart the embankments, leaf litter buried the edges. Within a few centuries of abandonment, the structures became essentially invisible from the ground. Only from the air, and only with technology that did not exist until the 21st century, could they be detected. What was the purpose of these earthworks? That is still debated. Some researchers think they had ceremonial or ritual functions. Others suggest defensive purposes. Some may have been related to water management or agriculture. The honest answer is that we do not have a definitive explanation for all of them, and given that the vast majority have never been excavated, we may not get one for a long time. But the sheer scale tells us something that no interpretation can avoid. Whatever these structures were for, they were built by a society, or a network of societies, that was large, organized, and capable of sustained labor over centuries. This was not a handful of isolated villages. This was a cultural landscape that stretched across thousands of square kilometers and persisted for more than 2 millennia. And until a few years ago, we had no idea it was there. If the geoglyphs of southwestern Amazonia reveal a hidden world in outline, geometric shapes cut into the earth, then the final stop on this journey fills in the picture with something closer to what most people would recognize as a civilization. In the Llanos de Mojos region of Bolivia, the same vast wetland savanna where the Baudes fish traps were found, LiDAR surveys revealed something that changed the conversation entirely. Beneath the forest canopy, researchers mapped an entire system of settlements belonging to the Casarabe culture, which flourished from roughly AD 500 to AD 1400. These were not villages, they were urban centers. Two of the largest sites covered approximately 147 and 315 hectares respectively. For scale, 315 hectares is more than 3 square kilometers, a footprint comparable to many medieval European towns. And within these centers, the LiDAR data revealed features that no one had expected to find in the pre-Columbian Amazon. Raised platforms, pyramidal structures up to 22 meters high, roughly the height of a 7-story building, extensive earthworks including canals and water reservoirs, and raised causeways, elevated roads, stretching for kilometers between settlements, linking them into a network. The settlement pattern was not random. It showed a clear hierarchy, 2 large centers at the top, surrounded by smaller secondary sites, which were in turn connected to still smaller peripheral settlements. This is the kind of spatial organization that archaeologists associate with political complexity, a system where some places are more important than others, where resources and authority are concentrated, where decisions made in one location affect people living kilometers away. The term researchers have used is low-density urbanism. It is an important concept because it challenges the assumption that city must mean stone walls, paved streets, and tightly packed buildings. The Casarabe centers were spread out. They were integrated into the surrounding landscape rather than walled off from it. They used earth and water rather than stone and mortar. But in terms of population, organization, infrastructure, and spatial complexity, they functioned as urban systems. The pyramidal structures are particularly striking. 22 meters is not a gentle rise in the terrain. It is a deliberate, engineered elevation, a mound built to be seen, to dominate the landscape, to serve whatever ceremonial, political, or practical function justified the labor of its construction. And unlike a pyramid in Egypt or Mesoamerica, this one was built in a tropical wetland, using earth that had to be dug, transported, and compacted in a climate that tries to dissolve everything back into mud. The causeways deserve their own moment. These raised roads were not footpaths. They were engineered linear structures, elevated above the floodplain, running straight for kilometers across open terrain. Building a raised road in a seasonal wetland is a serious infrastructure project. It requires not just moving earth, but understanding drainage, compaction, and long-term erosion. These causeways connected settlements, enabled year-round travel between sites that would otherwise be cut off during the wet season, and served as physical proof of a political and economic network linking multiple communities. And all of this was invisible until the laser went through the canopy. The Kasarabe discovery, published in Nature in 2022, was one of the most significant archaeological findings of the decade. It did not just add another site to the map. It demonstrated that complex, hierarchical urban-scale societies existed in the pre-Columbian Amazon, not as an exception, not as a marginal curiosity, but as a full-fledged cultural phenomenon with monumental architecture, engineered infrastructure, and regional political organization. The old narrative, that the Amazon was a pristine, untouched wilderness before Europeans arrived, is not just incomplete, it is wrong. The forest is not virgin, it is a graveyard of civilizations. Think about what we have just crossed in the last 30 minutes. An island of giant hybrid mounds where a society thrived for nearly 1,000 years on platforms they engineered above the flood. A circle of granite megaliths near the equator that may have tracked the sun, built by people no history book remembers. Faces carved into river rocks that surface only when the water drops to levels not seen in generations, proof that the river itself has shifted and that people were here long before we imagined. A fish-catching system covering more than 500 square kilometers of engineered floodplain designed to feed a population we were told could not exist. A 12-meter predator whose bite marks are still visible on a bone 13 million years old, a reminder that the Amazon's past is wilder and stranger than its present. Potentially tens of thousands of monumental earthworks hidden under the forest, built over millennia by cultures whose names we do not even know. And entire cities, with pyramids, causeways, and reservoirs, revealed only when lasers stripped away the canopy that had buried them for centuries. Each of these discoveries, on its own, would be enough to revise a paragraph in a textbook. Taken together, they tell a story that is harder to ignore. The Amazon basin was not a void. It was not a place where human history skipped a chapter. It was one of the most intensely inhabited, most creatively engineered, and most ecologically dramatic landscapes on the planet, and we are only now, in the 21st century, beginning to understand what happened there. The forest keeps its secrets well, but the lasers are getting sharper, the droughts are getting deeper, and the questions are getting harder to wave away. Whatever else is down there, under the canopy, beneath the rivers, buried in the sediment, we have barely started looking. Share this with someone who still thinks the Amazon was always just trees. And ask yourself, if this much was hidden in a place we thought we knew, what else is waiting in the places we have not looked at all?